Good morning. Hope you can hear me. Yes. Hi, I'm Bob Wiltenberg. I'm the Dean of University College. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this, on this first day of spring, to this 34th annual Saturday Lecture Series. Can't hear? Oh, now. This 34th annual Saturday Lecture Series sponsored by the Master of Liberal Arts program. The Master of Liberal Arts, our very first interdisciplinary program, was founded more than 30 years ago on a simple but far-reaching premise, that adult students taking on large questions and issues would need to draw upon many perspectives and many methods, employing in principle any and all resources of a great university. It's proven to be a most rewarding approach for both teachers and students, and we cordially invite you to join us not only for these 4 Saturdays, but in our courses and programs, both the Master of Liberal Arts and our new Doctor of Liberal Arts as well. Information on these and other university college programs is available here today out in the lobby or on our website at all times at ucollege.worcester.edu. Our title for this series, Athens to Ferguson, needs only a little explanation. In 2 days, we will reach the 6-month anniversary of the fatal shooting of a young black man by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, less than 10 miles from where we sit this morning. Much has happened in those 6 months. Media reports, protests, judicial investigations, actions, inactions, public hearings and debates with more of same and recommendations of many kinds still to come. Ferguson unrest now has its own Wikipedia entry. Google Ferguson crisis and you get more than 43 million hits. Ferguson is a name now known around the world, the ignition point not only for a civic crisis, but for a wide-ranging discussion and debate on matters of race and justice, policing and governance, and drawing reflection and commentary from many quarters. Washington University continues to respond both to the events and to the larger questions raised in many ways, much of it captured on the WashU Voices website, which I hope you will explore if you don't know it already. And just yesterday, in a series of stimulating conversations with faculty, students, and staff from every part of the university, sharing their work, their advice, and their hopes on matters of race and ethnicity. Our intended contribution in this series will be to gain some broader perspective, broader in time and in place, and to consider questions of justice, obligation, the shaping of communities that value racial and other differences within the special dynamic of urban life. For we are all, or nearly all, city dwellers now. At our first national census in 1790, only 1 in 20 Americans lived in a city. When Washington University was founded in the 1850s, it was still well under 20%. But industrialization sent it over 50% by 1920, and it's now more than 80% nationally and still growing. With some states like California as high as 95%. And just by the way, Missouri is at 70, Illinois at 88.5. What then is special about cities, both in the opportunities they offer and in the challenges they pose, for the great civilizational project of forging a life in common that includes all and benefits all? That's our agenda for the next 4 weeks. To get us started, we are very fortunate to have with us Susan Rotroff, Professor of Classics and the Jarvis Thurston and Mona Van Dyne Professor of the Humanities. Educated at Bryn Mawr and at Princeton, she taught in Canada, in Cape Town, in Athens, and in New York City before joining us here at Washington University in 1995. She is one of the world's leading archaeologists, a specialist in Greek Hellenistic pottery, author or editor of 12 books and countless, at least I couldn't count them, articles. Her work has been recognized with many, many honors and awards, including, among others, fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Guggenheim Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, that's the so-called Genius Grant, and the Gold Medal of the Archaeological Institute of America. And her CV contains some items you won't find in most people's. For the Kitzelbrunn shipwreck off the coast of Turkey a few years ago, she is listed not only as the ceramic consultant, but also as a diver. And further, she has served with a title that seems taken directly from the Iliad as a trench supervisor at Troy. Here on campus, she has been a much-loved mentor of many undergraduate and graduate students, and her wise advice is continually sought on committees across the university. We're delighted to have her here this morning, speaking on the topic of Athens, a place to begin. Susan?
Can you hear me? No. How about now? Is that better? Okay. Well, that's the kind of introduction that really makes you feel you do not recognize that person. That's very fulsome praise, and I thank you very much. And when you first asked me to participate in this series, I was very nervous. I thought this is such a big and important topic for our city. But those of you who know Bob Wiltenberg know that it's hard to turn him down. He's a neighbor of mine, and he's also a much valued colleague and a person I respect enormously. And so I thought that this is an offer I can't refuse. So it's an honor. It's a great challenge. And I thank him for both, and also I thank his staff for their support. So, okay, I'm going to take you on a trip through time and space this morning, starting in present-day Athens in the year 2008, to be precise, and then moving back to the year 430 BCE, to the height of Athens' power as an ancient city, and finally traveling 5,000 miles westward to the United States and the year 1863. It's a lot of movement, but these three vignettes, I think, will come together to tell a story. When Dean Wiltenberg first approached me about participating in a lecture series called From Athens to Ferguson, the first thing that came to my mind was an event in the recent history of the modern city of Athens. And some of you may remember this. Just after 9 p.m. on December 6th in 2008, young Alexandros Grigoropoulos was shot and killed by an Athenian police officer in the edgy neighborhood of Exarchia in Athens. He was 15 years old and unarmed. The incident began as an exchange of verbal abuse between a bunch of kids and two policemen. The policemen, in radio contact with their superiors, were ordered to back off, but they chose not to do so. Instead, they pursued the matter, and after a further slanging match, one of them drew his weapon and fired into a group of young people, killing Alexandros. Several weeks of violent demonstrations and riots followed. You see one picture there, in many cases suppressed equally violently by the police. Protests spread beyond the city and then beyond the country. There was even a small demonstration here in St. Louis. So far, the story is depressingly familiar. But in Athens, the policemen were immediately arrested. There were delays and a lengthy trial, but 2 years later, the shooter was convicted of intentional homicide and sentenced to life in prison. His partner is serving a 10-year sentence as an accomplice. Quite a different outcome, and for a wide range of reasons, not all of which I do not pretend to fathom, but I do understand some of them. The police are widely distrusted by the Greek populace in general, who also tend to be wary of all authorities. The officers had been insubordinate, so the police establishment could distance itself from them. Alexandros himself came from a relatively affluent family, and race did not come into play at all. Both the killer and his victim were white Europeans. As the violence escalated, it became clear that the shooting functioned as a catalyst for the expression of deep-seated frustrations in the population at large, but especially among young people. The worldwide economic crisis, even before Greece's disastrous debt situation was revealed a year or so later, was particularly hard on young people who suffered and still suffer a very high rate of unemployment and few or no prospects for the future. The anniversary of Alexandros' death is still observed with demonstrations in Greece, especially by students, but these frustrations have now played themselves out in the democratic process with the victory of the left-wing party Syriza in recent elections on a pledge of just saying no to continued austerity measures. So this is the Athens that immediately came to my mind when I was asked to participate in this series. And it made me think about how tragedies like those of Alexandros Grigoropoulos and Michael Brown have become far too common in our world, revealing deep flaws in human beings and in human societies. But this, I think, is not the Athens that the organizers had in mind when they asked me to speak. So I'm going to turn to another and very different Athens that existed on the same spot, but over 2,500 years ago. Now, how do we do that? Okay, thank you. Yeah, because some of these slides are very nice and you'd like to see them. I understand. Okay, we'll hope that that problem can be solved. So this was a rich and powerful place which has gained a reputation as a paragon of cities. And you see its ruins here, painted by Edward Lear, who you may know as an author of nonsense poetry, but he was also a very talented watercolorist in the mid-19th century before the growth of the modern city. What, if anything, does that city, placed on a pedestal as it is, have to tell us about what a city can be or could be? As it turns out, there is a single and powerful text that can provide some answers, a text that will summarize not only Athens, what Athens was, but what Athens stands for. But before I turn to that, let me set the scene with a brief sketch of the ancient city. Athens, for us the name of metropolitan center, is shorthand for a small ancient state in the Balkan Peninsula. You can see its position here at the southern tip of mainland Greece. In formal terms, it was a polis, a Greek term often translated into English as city-state, a single city, the star on the larger map, and the countryside that she dominated, dark green on that map. Athens was the name of both the city and the state, and her wider territory was known as Attica. This was a typical form of ancient political organization, and ancient Greece was made up of many of these small, independent entities. And I do mean small. The state was about the size of Rhode Island, a little bit smaller, actually. Most people lived in villages in the countryside. Okay, I think I can still see. Great. That's wonderful. Yes, I can see. Okay. That's not important. Okay, most people lived in villages in the countryside, and you might imagine this countryside, the coastal region of the southern part of Attica today, but inhabited by 1/10 the population. Modern-day Attica has something in excess of 3 million inhabitants. In antiquity, it was close to 300,000. So about 1 in 8 or 9 of these people lived in the urban concentration made up by the city of Athens and her port. And I thank Bob Wiltenberg for providing us with some fascinating comparative statistics on that. So these were a very rural people on the whole, but with one important urban concentration. The walled city itself was also small by modern standards. The walls have been uncovered in bits and pieces under the modern city, but a modern reconstruction on paper can give you an idea of the town's layout. The area within the walls of Athens was about 530 acres, well under a square mile. You could have walked across the city in an hour. The distance is about the same as that from the western end of the WashU campus to the St. Louis Art Museum. I thank one of my clever students for pointing out this statistic to me. It encompassed public and private spaces, houses and public spaces in the lower city, including the central square, center of government, the agora here, spread out around the Acropolis, which was more or less in the center. Once it had been a fortress, but in historical times it was the religious center of the city, and now, of course, an archaeological site that has come to symbolize Western culture. People had been living for thousands of years in this place, since the prehistoric period. But at the end of the 6th century, a remarkable thing happened. In this little state, like all other little states in the Greek world, power had always been in the hands of the wealthy and the well-born, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in the person of a single autocrat. In 510 BCE, with the military assistance of the Spartans, Athens had ejected an autocratic ruler, and various aristocratic factions began contending for political power. This was business as usual in an archaic Greek state. But things took an unexpected turn in 508 BC, when Athens established a completely new and unique form of government. One of the parties in this factional struggle was a man named Cleisthenes, a member of Athens' most ancient and powerful family. And in the words of Herodotus, a historian who wrote his account of these events over 50 years later, this Cleisthenes, quote, took the people into partnership. In other words, failing to overcome or to form a coalition with another aristocratic faction, he turned to the common people as his allies. The result was a revolutionary new system which gave each male citizen a vote, a form of government that was later to be known as demokratia, people power, or democracy. 20 years later, this young democracy was sorely challenged by an invasion from without, as the powerful Persian Empire, centered in what is today Iran, attempted to annex the Greek states. In the face of this threat, the Greek cities, which were more often at war with one another than not, forgot their differences and banded together against the common enemy. Against all expectation, they defeated the Persians in 479 BCE, and Athens embarked on a period of military and cultural brilliance. With that brief description of where and what Athens was, we're ready to turn to the question of what did Athens stand for. The city's name is bandied about as some sort of model. It's the highest praise to call a city the Athens of X. You fill in the blank. So Edinburgh is the Athens of the North. Boston is the Athens of America. Nashville is the Athens of the South. Columbia is the Athens of Missouri. And the list goes on and on. These formulations variously lay claim to Athens' reputation as the cradle of democracy, as a center of culture and education, as a beautiful city ornamented with impressive monuments. Most famously, the Parthenon. Here, in a few views, as it has evolved into a national symbol over the last century and a half. Here you see it surrounded by Turkish houses at the beginning of the 19th century in a watercolor by the Irish painter and traveler Edward Dodwell, while Athens was still a part of the Ottoman Empire. Here, recovered as an ancient structure by the removal of those houses in a view taken by the Greek photographer Petros Moraitis. Undergoing its first extensive program of reconstruction at the beginning of the 20th century. After that work, as it stood until the 1980s, when a new and much more thoroughgoing program of reconstruction and conservation began and continues to this day. And of interest in this connection, in 2008, festooned with a banner as part of the demonstrations following the death of Alexandros Grigoropoulos. The statement of the students who displayed the banner, which I've quoted on the screen, makes clear the symbolism of the site, at least in their eyes. This building, part treasury, part victory monument, and we aren't even sure that it ever functioned as a temple, the Parthenon was built to honor the goddess Athena in the 3rd quarter of the 5th century BCE. Modern architectural giants, of course, dwarf it, but it was an enormous building for its own time, the largest ever constructed in the Greek mainland up to that point. Its footprint was about the same as Gibbons Hall here on the WashU campus, which may not seem impressive in modern terms, but that was a big ancient building. It was made completely of fine pentelic marble, a fine-grained stone quarried in the Attic hills, and its subtle design involved repeated proportions and tiny adjustments that required that each block be custom tooled and fitted to its precise place in the building. It was lavishly decorated with yards and yards of sculpture celebrating the goddess, the forces of order and civilization, and the Athenian state. A long frieze, most of it now in the British Museum, and a recurrent and famous bone of contention between Greece and Britain. The frieze displays the procession of the citizens on the goddess's festival. In these two tiny excerpts, the cavalry rides through the city, and sacrificial heifers approach the altar, leaping forward eagerly to offer their lives to Athena. It is carved in a cool, ideal style, and I stress the word ideal. Cavalry do not parade nude and unarmed, and real cows do not seek out immolation. And the Athenians were never so homogeneous. The artists have carved the same handsome young man over and over, youths without a care or even perhaps a thought in their beautiful heads. The construction of the Parthenon and many other buildings on the Acropolis and elsewhere in Athens was the brainchild of the statesman Pericles. Here in a Roman copy of a portrait bust with an inscription that removes all doubt about his identity. Pericles, the son of Xanthippus, the Athenian. Pericles was a member of the same ancient and wealthy family as the founder of democracy. In fact, his mother was the man's niece. Born shortly before the Persian Wars, he had been too young to fight, but as a teenager, he would have abandoned Athens with his fellow citizens, watched as she was sacked by the Persians, and returned to a city of charred ruins. He would have been part of the crew of men, women, and children who raced to build the city wall quickly after their return, before Sparta, already wary of the Athenians, could prevent its construction. 20 years later, in 460, Pericles was elected to the generalship, Athens' most important political office, and he was re-elected yearly until his death in 429. Although he was an aristocrat and frequently criticized for his high-handedness and aloof manner, he maintained and supported the democratic form of government. This was no obstacle, however, to the accumulation of an empire. Begun in the wake of the Persian Wars, the Athenian Empire grew during Pericles' generalship, eventually to the point of threatening its only serious rival, the heavily militarized state of Sparta, some 100 miles to the south. In 431 BCE, this rivalry blossomed into outright conflict, the 25-year-long struggle known as the Peloponnesian War, which would end in a defeat from which Athens would never recover. But say what you will about Pericles, and plenty of his contemporaries had unflattering things to say, he had an absolute pride and faith in his city, and he had vision. Some of what we know about Pericles comes from the writings of the historian Thucydides, another aristocrat and military man about 30 years his junior. Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, which he lived through himself, and he certainly knew Pericles firsthand and admired him. In that history, he records a speech that Pericles made in 430, at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, the so-called Epitaphios Logos, or funeral oration. You see here a heavily annotated modern text of the oration. This copy belonged to Herbert Weir Smythe, the Elliott Professor of Greek Literature at Harvard University in the early 20th century. And most memorably for anyone who has studied ancient Greek, he was the author of Smythe's Greek Grammar, still an essential reference for any serious student of the language. His notations can give you an idea of the care with which this extraordinarily rich but difficult bit of Greek prose has been scrutinized over the years. Thucydides takes pains to inform his reader about the occasion of this speech. The hostilities of the war had begun in 431. Pericles' strategy was to cede control of the land to the Spartans. They had the more powerful army, and the Athenians were very unlikely to be able to defeat them in a land battle. Instead, Pericles depended on control of the seas, where the Athenians were without rival. And so the entire populace crowded into the walled city, while Spartan armies ravaged their beloved farms in the countryside of Attica. So from being a rural people, they became a very urban people. If you would believe Thucydides, 100% of the people had moved into the city. Conditions were miserable, crowded, and unsanitary, and military successes during the first year of that war had been few. At the end of the campaigning season, the Athenians held a public funeral for those who had fallen in battle. This was a unique Athenian practice. Other cities buried their dead on the battlefield, but the Athenians customarily cremated the fallen, brought the remains home, and buried them at state expense in a common tomb in the public cemetery. Here is Thucydides' account of the custom. 3 days before the ceremony, the bones of the dead are laid out in a tent that has been erected, and their relatives bring whatever offerings they please. Thucydides doesn't tell us where this took place, but most likely in the Agora, the civic center of Athens that you see pictured here just below the Acropolis. Carts carry the bones to the cemetery in cypress coffins, one for each of the 10 tribes. Any citizen or foreigner who wants to joins in the procession, and the female relatives are there to lament at the burial. The route would have taken them to the city gate along the great Panathenaic processional road, an avenue some 80 feet wide, very monumental for an ancient city. Passing through the gate and turning slightly to the north, the carts would have proceeded down an even wider avenue that led to the gymnasium of Hecademus that would later host Plato's Academy. And, Thucydides tells us, the dead are laid in the Demosion Sema, the public burial ground in the most beautiful suburb of the city. Fragments of the public tombs have been discovered, and you see a couple of examples here, inscribed with the names of the dead. Much later, I take a little side road from Thucydides, the traveler Pausanias, visiting the city of Athens in the 2nd century of the Common Era, adds the information that the names of the dead were listed on slabs above their graves, and many fragments of these too have been found, battered and incomplete, but recognizable for what they are, and certainly recognizable to us who know the custom of inscribing the names of the dead on civic monuments in small places and in large ones. So a fragment of one of these lists here. In the votive relief on the left, which had been set up on the Acropolis earlier in the 5th century, the goddess Athena contemplates such a slab, perhaps reading the names of the fallen heroes of her city. To return to Thucydides' account, he tells us that when the bodies have been buried, a man chosen by the city, outstanding in reputation and intellect, and foremost in reputation, delivers a eulogy. In 430 BCE, that man was Pericles. How do we know what Pericles said? Thucydides was almost certainly present and heard the speech himself, but there were no recording devices, and stenography would not be invented for another 400 years. Now, Thucydides' history is peppered with speeches, and fortunately, he does tell us something about his methodology in reproducing them. He says, "Some I heard myself, others I got from various quarters. It was difficult to remember them word for word, so my habit had been to make the speakers say what was, in my opinion, demanded of them by the various occasions. of course, adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what they really said. Beginning in antiquity, some have claimed that the speech was completely the work of Thucydides, or even that Pericles never gave any speech at all. But many people must have heard the speech, and Thucydides was not at liberty to invent something out of whole cloth. We certainly don't have Pericles' exact words. We have at best Pericles through the lens of Thucydides. But for our purposes, it doesn't matter. We have a contemporary rhetorical presentation of the virtues of classical Athenian state at its apogee. It's a fairly long speech. The whole thing takes up chapters 35 to 46 in the second book of Thucydides' history. About 1,000 words in the Greek, though most translations nearly double the length. The Greek is very economically expressed. And rereading parts of it again in preparation for this talk, I was reminded of how ferociously compressed and difficult the language is. The format is in large part formulaic. Pericles began with praise for the ancestors who built the Athenian state. And he ends with praise for the fallen men and an exhortation to the living to be worthy of their sacrifice. But the speech is dominated by its central section devoted, he's trying to roll away, by its central section devoted to, quote, our Constitution and the way of life that has made us great. Here Pericles paints an ideal portrait of a state where the rights of the individual and the needs of the community are perfectly in harmony, where the state and the citizen come together almost as one. I recommend the whole speech to you. There are many translations available online and in the library, but this morning I will excerpt just a few phrases most relevant to this ideal portrait. Pericles begins by emphasizing the unique and original form of the Athenian state. It's its own invention, and it imitates none. Our state, he says, is called a democracy because control resides in the hands of the majority, not just a few. This state fosters equality. The laws stipulate equality for everyone in matters of private dispute. This is a more sweeping statement than it might appear to be, since in the absence of a system of public prosecution in Athens, most criminal cases as well as suits were privately instigated. Of course, Pericles knew that everyone was not equal in many ways, but he stresses ability over status. For positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership in a particular class, but the excellence that each man possesses. The important point was that everyone had an equal chance to contribute. Political life, we all join in freely. In private life, Athenians are tolerant, he tells us. We don't get upset with our neighbor if he enjoys himself in his own way. We are free and tolerant in our private lives. And note again the emphasis on freedom. Pericles will refer to it again at the end of the oration, famously maintaining that the secret of happiness is freedom, and the secret of freedom is courage. Athenian citizens are law-abiding. We obey those who have been placed in positions of authority, and we obey the laws, especially those for the protection of the oppressed, and the unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break. But they're not workaholics. We have abundant occasion for relaxation, contests, and festivals throughout the year. Athenians live in an atmosphere of openness, not fear. Our city is open to the world, and we have no periodical deportations to keep people from observing our secrets for military advantage. But all of the cultural and intellectual pursuits of the Athenians are not incompatible with vigorous action. Our love of the beautiful does not lead to extravagance. Our love of the things of the mind does not make us soft. On top of this, everyone, or every man, is profoundly engaged in the political process. we regard a man who takes no interest in public affairs not as unambitious, but as downright useless. Pretty scary idea. The word rendered here as unambitious is hard to translate. It could mean inactive or leisured or minding his own business. But the word translated as useless is unambiguous. It's a harsh criticism. Pericles then tops it all off with the famous précis. To sum up, I say that Athens is the school of Hellas. So such is Pericles' portrait of his city at the point of her greatest success. Stirring stuff. But when the dazzle fades, we might pause to wonder just how lifelike this portrait is. Sculptural portraits of the period, like other art, as you've already seen, were highly ideal. Observe the portrait of Pericles. Not a wrinkle, not a flaw, from his perfectly curved eyebrow to his artfully curled beard. It's a bit like Thucydides' speeches, what a statesman ought to have looked like. So let's put some of the claims beside some of the realities. What about the democracy that Pericles praises at the beginning of his speech? This sketchy relief decorated a marble slab that was inscribed with an ancient law against tyranny that was passed about 100 years after the time of the funeral oration. It shows democracy, a feminine noun in Greek, and therefore a female figure on the right, placing a crown on the head of demos, the people, a masculine noun in Greek, and therefore a male figure. But the demos really was male. It consisted of the male citizens. Citizen women had some protections, legal protections, but no vote, no involvement in government, and no freedom of action, though they played a crucial role in the generation of citizens. In accordance with a law passed 20 years earlier and supported by Pericles, only a person born to two citizen parents could be a citizen. Otherwise, it took an act of the assembly to create a new citizen, and these were vanishingly rare. In short, it was virtually impossible to become a citizen if you had not been born one. A look at the population as a whole shows how restricted democratic power actually was. These figures are estimates. We don't have ancient census figures. They're based on bits and pieces of data, and except for the number of male citizens, they are open to challenge. But they are not wild guesses, and they can give us at least a sense of the makeup of the population of Attica. There were probably about 43,000 male citizens at the time Pericles gave his speech, about 5,000 of which normally lived within the city itself, and they are the ones with a vote. Beyond that, there are citizen women and children, a large population of non-citizen long-term residents called medics, literally those who live with us, and of course slaves. Male citizens with full rights and a vote make up only 14% of the population, but it's actually a bit worse than that. Athenian laws are prefaced by the phrase, "It seemed best to the council and the demos," the people, recording the fact that the demos had voted for the measure in its assembly. The assembly place of this period has been identified and excavated, and it held no more than 6,000 people. So in the end, the people making any decision constituted something like 2% of the population. One marked difference between modern America and the ancient Athenian state is the apparent homogeneity of Athens. The events at Ferguson, in particular, point starkly at the issue of race, a concern that is absent from our Athenian texts. A close look shows, however, that especially within the walls of the city of Athens, the population was far from uniform. It's even possible that the citizens were in the minority there. Since medics, free non-citizens, couldn't own real estate, they gravitated to the city where they could earn a living through trade or industry. And we can get just a peek of the diversity in various indirect ways. For example, by looking at the names of the artisans who signed the vases they potted or painted. So here we have an amasis an Egyptian name. We have Lydos, the Lydian, indicating an origin in what is today Turkey, and Siriskos, the Little Syrian, indicating an origin on the Levantine coast. There were Africans in Athens, almost never mentioned in writing, but occasionally pictured. A groom brushing down a horse, a soldier fighting in a colorful cloak, a servant at a dinner party. They were largely servants or slaves, but few slaves were black, and those who have examined the matter in detail have concluded that the Athenians did not discriminate on the basis of skin color. They discriminated on the basis of a lot of other things, but not on that basis. But their city was certainly far more diverse than the texts would lead us to believe. A substantial proportion of people living within the walls were not citizens, though many would or could have been visually indistinguishable from citizens. In the matter of equality, it's clear that male citizens had infinitely more rights than the remaining 86%, and that some residents had no rights at all. But there is one curious exception, and that is in the matter of the supreme sacrifice. The inscribed lists that stood above the graves of the fallen listed not only citizens, but also medics, foreigners, and even slaves. And I've circled the word therapontes, slaves, that has been preserved on one list. There's also an ancient text that tells us that slaves were listed. So in this one arena, everyone in the population found equality, or rather all of the males, since women, of course, did not go into battle. Pericles boasts of a tolerant and law-abiding society, but we know from a healthy collection of speeches delivered in the law courts that laws were broken and that prosecutions were common. We can also point to a large collection of equipment for the law courts, water clocks for timing the speeches that you see above, especially its designed ballots for efficient voting, just as a couple of examples. As for tolerance for an irritating neighbor, it was, of course, the Athenians who condemned Socrates to death about 30 years after this speech. He was a paradigmatically irritating neighbor who famously described himself as the gadfly of Athens. Now, the prosecution was undoubtedly politically motivated, but it hardly speaks for a tolerance of differences of opinion. There is no question about the rich festival calendar. The Athenians had something like 150 religious festivals a year, involving athletic contests, cultural events, plays, songs, feasts, and the like. And there is no question either about appreciation for the beautiful. Witness the Parthenon. But this most lavish of buildings is not exactly a poster child for beauty without extravagance. Finally, Pericles' assertion that Athens was the school of Hellas was perhaps little more than wishful thinking. The Athenians tried hard to export their form of government, democracy, to the states under their control, but with only limited success. Few states spontaneously followed the model, and many resisted its imposition from above. Why this speech, then, when one could point to so many instances in which the reality does not match Pericles' description? One reason is its genre. A funeral oration was not meant to persuade or describe. It was intended to display the rhetorical abilities of the speaker and to delight its audience. The stately burial of war heroes was not the occasion for grim realities, and Pericles will naturally have wanted to emphasize the greatness of the city for which these men had given their lives. It's also important to consider the speech in the context of the artistry of Thucydides' history. Within one paragraph of the end of this uplifting piece of oratory, Thucydides launches on his graphic description of the devastating plague that broke out in Athens in the following year. In all likelihood, it was a result of the overcrowding of the city, the wild card that Pericles could not have foreseen in his strategy. The plague is thought to have killed a third of the population, including Pericles himself. After that, the city was, in Thucydides' opinion at any rate, left without effective leadership, and began a slow process of increasingly harsh rule and intemperate political life. With the funeral oration, Thucydides brought the praise of an ideal city to a climax, from which all that followed would be diminuendo. But whatever the reasons, rhetorical, political, or literary, that lie behind the text that we have, Pericles and Thucydides between them have left us the most perfect description of what a democracy could be. Ironically, Pericles was a member of the uppermost elite, while we can infer from Thucydides' text that he was no great admirer of democracy as a form of government. But no matter their political sympathies, no matter that the state described never existed, and no matter that Athens was not really the school of Hellas, she went on to become the school of successive generations of humanity. In the following century, and increasingly down through Roman times, Athens became the foremost center for the study of philosophy, a schoolroom for generations of thinkers and doers, from Plato and Aristotle through the Hellenistic kings and Roman statesmen like Cicero. This is imagined here in a Roman mosaic of the first century of the Common Era, the philosophers in the grove of the Academy, not far from the public burial ground, with the walled city shining in the distance. And in the Renaissance, artists like Raphael could imagine Athens as the ideal society of thinkers brought together in one place and time in his painting, The School of Athens, where Plato and Aristotle aired their differences in the company of famous philosophers, artists, and other public figures. Repeatedly over the ages, Pericles' invented city has been held up as a model of what a city could be. More convincing, perhaps, if one believed that human beings did once achieve such a society. I have neither the time nor the expertise to follow the long afterlife of the funeral oration, in which Athens is an increasingly distant but ever more golden prospect. But I would like briefly to mention one chapter that is particularly relevant to our American condition. The stock of the ancient Greeks was very high in the America of the second half of the 19th century. Educated people knew their Greek and their ancient history, and they actively looked for guidance in the texts and events of the ancient past. The two speakers at the dedication of the cemetery at Gettysburg in 1863 were keenly aware of the Athenian precedent. The main oratorical event of the occasion, Edward Everett's very long and largely forgotten speech, began with a learned lecture on the Athenian state's burial practices and Pericles' speech. But of course, what we now remember are Abraham Lincoln's brief remarks. I know I learned them by heart as a school child, and I'm sure many of you did too. As Gary Wills has shown eloquently in his fine book, Lincoln at Gettysburg, the president's words echo those of Pericles, lifting them out of their ancient setting and making them anew for his own American time. Wills argues that the address was not only a fine and meticulously crafted piece of oratory, it was also a game changer for America with its insistence on equality and liberty, principles that Pericles too had insisted on for Athens. The equality of all men was clearly a proposition that not everyone bought into in 1863, as not only the Civil War itself, but also contemporary adverse reaction to Lincoln's address show. But instead of painting a rosy picture, Lincoln exhorted his audience to complete the project that the founders of the nation had hinted at in the Declaration of Independence. The events of Ferguson have shown how very far we have to go, but perhaps we can use this tragedy as Pericles used the fallen Athenian soldiers and Lincoln used the dead at Gettysburg to forge a new commitment to the hard work of building a society where the rights and lives of all persons will be equally respected and protected. Thank you.